construction that went on here at Fort Meigs, as well as the design of the fort and why it's placed where it is. Now, construction on Fort Meigs was undertaken through the late winter in 1813 into the spring of 1813. So they started in early February, finished at the end of April into early May. So it took the soldiers here about 3 months to build Fort Meigs. The fort itself stands about 10 acres on the inside and about a mile all the way around. It's designed to hold about 2,000 men, and at its height it was home to about 3,500. At that time, Fort Meigs was actually considered the largest city in Ohio. As I was mentioning before, it took them about 3 months to build this fort. As they were building it, they actually deforested this area on this side of the river for about a half mile all the way around. The reason that they deforested so much of the land is so that way, for one thing, it provides them with enough timber to build the fort, but it also gives all the soldiers inside the fort who are on defensive duty about a half a mile of clear line of sight. So if any enemies are approaching, they will know that they're coming before they're within weapons range. During the construction, there are Native Americans out here in the woods surrounding the fort. They're going to try to come in and pick off American soldiers while they're working on the fort. What they're trying to do is they're trying to stall us. They're trying to slow us down so that way when the British arrive, we won't have Fort Meigs completely finished. That didn't really work all too well because Fort Meigs was finished before the British arrived, but we'll get more into that here in a little bit. Excuse me. Now, while they were building this fort, they did start in the wintertime. So you would imagine that the ground would be nice and hard and frozen. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They said that in their journals that 1812 and 1813 were unusually warm winters in this region. One of the main reasons that they wanted to march up here to this position through the winter is they were hoping that the Great Black Swamp would be frozen over, so they wouldn't have to deal so much with the marshy conditions. They would be lucky enough on a normal basis to get their cannons to move about a mile a day. When they arrived here, they found out how unseasonably warm it was, and the ground was basically just barely frozen enough so that way after the first part of the column passed through, as the cannons start coming through, the entire path has now been turned into a sea of mud. Soldiers who were on the march up here said that on any given day, they were marching through knee-high mud and waist-high water. When they arrived here at Fort Meigs, the soldiers that were here were dealing with those same conditions on a daily basis. And a lot of them would actually measure how their day was going depending on the amount of mud that they actually had to trudge through. They said if the mud was up to the sole of your shoe, that was a pretty good day. It ranges anywhere from that to what they would consider a bad day, where you would sink down to your knee every time you put your foot on the ground. That's how much mud there was here. One officer, his name was Joseph Larwell, he wrote in his journal that it was almost impossible to get from one tent to the other due to how deep the mud actually was. So these are the conditions that they're working through as they're building this fort. So just try to keep that in mind, try to make that mental picture. There would be no trees and no grass. All the plant life had been trampled over. So that's one of the things we always try to convey to people, just try to make that mental image and see if you can imagine how the soldiers would have been dealing with these conditions. Now, as I mentioned before, Fort Meigs is placed where it is because it's along the Maumee River Rapids. The rapids, well, it's at the foot of the rapids, which is the shallowest point at which you can cross onto either side of the river. At this time, there are no bridges across the Maumee River, so the soldiers are dependent on the river rapids. By placing the fort on this side of the rapids, the American Army can stop the British from pushing any further south into the Ohio country, as well as regulate their travel up onto the other side of the river. The reason that they're on this side of the river and not on the north side is that if they ever had to retreat, if they lost the fort, they didn't want to have to try to retreat back across the river. They wanted to already be in what they considered safe territory. Now on the wall over here, we have several depictions of forts from the late 1700s and early 1800s. These basically are the general shape of what a fort usually is. So it's a pentagon, a star, or a square. Fort Meigs, as you can tell from this is a better map to see it from, doesn't fit with any of those standards. Fort Meigs is unique insofar as it contours to the land that it sits on. This part right here is about a 40 to 50 foot bluff. And Fort Meigs has the wall sit directly on the edge of that bluff. Over here is a large floodplain that you have to cross once you get across the river. The idea was that if the British tried to mount an assault on Fort Meigs, they'd have to get across the river while being fired at by artillery. Once they got to the floodplain, they'd be within musket range. So they'd have artillery and muskets firing at the same time. If they could get across the floodplain, then they'd have to charge up that bluff. And the British would still be dealing with those same muddy conditions that the soldiers are inside of the fort. So the whole time, they're going to be fired upon from on top of this high position. So this gave the Americans a very defensive position from which to fight against the British. Now, the hill extends from about where Blockhouse 1 is, all the way around to about Wood's Battery, maybe even over a little bit to Huckel's Battery, which is this one right here. Now, from here, on the south side and on the west side, there's no hill. It's all flat land. If any enemy got around to the south or west sides, the Americans would be open to attack. So what they did is they actually dug about a 6 foot deep by 6 foot wide trench in front of the wall on each side. That way, as enemy attackers are trying to get into the fort, they'll file into the trenches and then open themselves up to an attack. As we're leaving the fort today, if you can remember, or if somebody remembers and wants me to point it out, I'll do that. If you look to the left, the cannon window for this blockhouse lines directly up with where that 6 foot deep trench would be. As the attackers are filing into the trench, they're going to be lined up directly with that cannon. They load one shot, fire, they'll take out an entire line of attackers with a single shot. So this whole fort is designed with a defensive attitude in mind. Did anybody have any questions so far?
Would they fire a canister at that point? Or?
Yeah, you'd load your cannon with case shot. Just because the scatter effect will eviscerate anything in its path.
It's a depiction here of them taking the stumps out. What would be the point in that? We're to clear the land.
Mostly to clear the land, because you want to have a nice open field for where you're going to be having your camps and where you're going to have your soldiers marching through on a daily basis.
Why not have trees on the inside before it catch fire, camping, or?
Well, that would happen. That's one of the possibilities. Also, just to help have enough timber for all of the fort itself.
You also move in line.